At 2:17 in the black water between Oman and Iran, the illusion died first. Not with a speech. Not with a warning. Not with a flag lowered in surrender. It died in silence, inside radar rooms that suddenly saw ghosts, inside command bunkers that no longer trusted their screens, inside missile crews waiting for orders that would never arrive. For years, the Strait of Hormuz had been treated like a loaded trigger pressed against the world's throat. A narrow channel. A global artery. A place where a few miles of sea could shake empires, spike oil prices, and drag fleets into history. Tehran believed that made it untouchable. Washington came to prove that it did not. Because this was never just about a strip of water. It was about leverage. About a doctrine built on proximity, pressure, and fear. Iran's military planners had spent years shaping a brutal equation. If they could not outmatch the United States in open ocean warfare, they would choke the passage instead. Mines seeded into shipping lanes. Anti-ship missiles hidden in cliffs and hardened tunnels. Fast attack craft waiting like hornets behind breakwaters. Drones stacked in launch bays. Coastal radar stitched into a lattice meant to track, harass, overwhelm, and, if necessary, shut the strait long enough to bring the global economy to its knees. Not forever. Just long enough. Long enough to prove that the world still had to reckon with them. And for a while, that threat worked. Tanker insurers watched the map with dread. Energy traders priced fear into every rumor. Regional capitals calculated risk in hours and barrel counts. In war games and briefings, the same phrase came back again and again, the choke point. The implication was simple. If Iran truly chose escalation, the first days would belong to geography. Narrow waters favor the ambusher. Clutter favors the patient. Shorelines crowded with missile batteries favor the state willing to hide steel under rock and wait. Tehran built confidence around that idea until confidence hardened into myth. Then the myth met the reversal. The American response did not begin with ships surging dramatically over the horizon. It began months earlier, buried in patterns so ordinary they looked forgettable. Cargo traffic. Routine patrols. Maritime surveillance. Electronic whispers across the Gulf. Signals intelligence teased apart command relationships. Satellite revisits mapped the rhythms of fuel trucks, missile transload points, underground access roads, and boat pens. Cyber teams studied firmware and logistics software. Analysts layered heat signatures over construction changes near Bandar Abbas, Keshem, Larak, and the smaller islands that sat like stone teeth above the sea lanes. The United States did not intend to fight the strait as Iran imagined it. It intended to hollow out the idea of control before the shooting even started. By the time Tehran thought it was tightening its grip, it was already operating inside a trap. Decoys had pulled attention outward. False emissions suggested one naval picture while submarines and low-observable aircraft shaped another. Communications relays were mapped. Redundant command nodes were identified. Known launch boxes were tagged, but more importantly, so were the concealed ones, the emergency revetments, the disguised garage shelters, the secondary tunnels dug into folded terrain above the coast. The confidence inside Iran's anti-access network came from its layers. The American plan was built to make those layers blind, isolated, and late. Then the elite formation entered the story. It was not one unit. It was a machine made of many parts, assembled for one narrow purpose. A carrier strike group held outside the most obvious kill zones, its aircraft cycling in disciplined patterns. Guided missile destroyers with air defense umbrellas and land attack reach. Attack submarines moving where surface radar could not follow. Marine and naval aviation poised for rapid suppression of coastal threats. Special operations elements tasked not with spectacle, but with precision, target designation, terminal guidance, seizure of critical facilities, and confirmation of what satellites could not see beneath reinforced concrete. Over all of it sat the invisible architecture modern war depends on: ISR feeds, electronic warfare aircraft, space-based surveillance, airborne relays, cyber operators, and commanders watching a battlespace assembled from fragments of light, code, and probability. The mission itself was brutally simple in wording and impossibly complex in execution. Prevent closure of the Strait of Hormuz, destroy the infrastructure that could sustain a prolonged interdiction campaign, and break the credibility of Iran's coastal coercion in a single relentless sequence. Not a symbolic hit. Not a limited reprisal. A systemic dislocation. The launchers, the sensors, the mine control cells, the swarm boat coordination nodes, the underground stockpiles, the command chain that fused them together, those were the real targets. The objective was not only to survive the first strike. It was to make the second one impossible. In the final hours before execution, the Gulf became unnaturally still. Tankers altered routes under escort. Commercial traffic thinned. Patrol aircraft widened their circles. American officers spoke less. Checklists narrowed. Screens glowed in red-lit compartments where no one needed to raise a voice. Pilots traced routes that threaded between threat rings measured down to seconds. Boarding teams checked weapons they hoped not to use for long. Intelligence specialists scrubbed last-minute anomalies from feeds arriving from satellites, drones, submarines, and listening posts across the region. Somewhere inland, Iranian officers probably sensed tension rising. But sensing tension is not the same as seeing the blade. The approach began under a moonless ceiling, with the sea reflecting almost nothing. Submarines moved first, positioning for strike windows and surveillance of coastal traffic. Above them, long-endurance drones watched road movement near suspected missile sites. Farther back, electronic warfare assets started to lean into the spectrum, not enough to announce themselves, just enough to salt the environment with doubt. GPS reception flickered. Radar returns thickened with false clutter. Air defense operators saw tracks that dissolved, then reappeared where they should not have been. Minutes later, the first cyber effects rolled through selected nodes, subtle and surgical. Lag in command confirmation, corrupted location data, delayed handshakes between sensors and shooters. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make a brittle system hesitate. That hesitation was fatal. The opening blows landed almost simultaneously. Standoff munitions reached radar stations overlooking the coastal bends east of Bandar Abbas. Hardened communication hubs went dark. Power feeds to select tunnel entrances failed as precision strikes hit transformer yards and backup generators. Air defense batteries that might have covered the coastline were jammed, spoofed, or destroyed before crews fully understood they were under a coordinated assault. On the water, fast attack craft trying to disperse from their pens were tracked the moment they moved. Some never cleared harbor mouths. Others were caught in narrow channels where maneuver meant nothing against overhead surveillance and precision fire. Then the assault accelerated. Aircraft came in low and timed, not in chaotic waves but in a sequence designed to peel away Iran's denial network layer by layer. One package suppressed surviving sensors. Another cratered launch aprons and sealed cave mouths. Naval fires struck boat storage compounds and ammunition points. Secondary explosions lifted orange light over the coast, revealing in brief flashes the geometry of years of preparation: revetments, berms, hidden ramps, blast doors, fuel bladders, missile canisters, all the hardware of a strategy built around the narrowest part of the map. The entire concept had depended on surviving long enough to create panic. Instead, it was being dismantled before it could fully speak. And in that violence, the special operations teams moved. They crossed the last distance in the thin seam between shock and confusion. Inserted by air and sea on separate axes, they were not there to conquer terrain. They were there to exploit rupture. One element hit a coastal command villa used as a hardened emergency coordination site, clearing room by room through dust, alarms, and severed lighting. Another secured a launch control annex near a concealed missile support area, confirming target folders and transmitting updated coordinates before demolition charges went in. A third moved on a logistics node connected to naval mine deployment, less dramatic than a missile battery, perhaps, but just as important. Wars are not sustained by slogans. They are sustained by inventories, schedules, keys, and fuel. Inside those facilities, the discoveries began to matter. Not because they were cinematic trophies, but because they revealed how close the threat had been to maturity. Crates of advanced sea mines stacked in climate-controlled chambers. Prepared drone racks with pre-programmed maritime routes. Targeting tables for commercial lanes and naval escorts. Redundant communication plans meant to survive early bombardment. Rosters of rapid dispersal crews. Emergency fallback frequencies. Spare seekers. Mobile anti-ship launchers disguised under civilian pattern covers. What American planners had feared was confirmed in the hard language of captured hardware and command data. Tehran had not merely built a bluff. It had built a campaign architecture. It intended to turn the strait into a weapon, then hide behind the chaos it created. One underground complex, bored deep into the rock above the coast, held the most important prize of the night. Behind blast doors and angled corridors designed to defeat overpressure, intelligence teams found the nerve center linking coastal surveillance, missile assignment, swarm boat dispatch, and minefield activation. This was not a symbolic bunker. This was the spine. Here, operators could fuse radar plots with drone feeds and distribute firing solutions across dispersed units that never needed to see the whole picture for the system to function. Strip away that coordination, and the network devolved into fragments. Dangerous, yes, but no longer orchestrated. The command staff had believed depth, concrete, and secrecy were enough. They had not accounted for being found before the first hour was done. Outside, the coastline was now lit by staggered impacts and burning fuel. What had been planned as a dense anti-access curtain had become pockets of isolated resistance. Some Iranian crews fought with discipline. Others tried to relocate and were caught in transit. Some missile teams attempted emergency launch procedures from improvised positions, only to discover their targeting links were broken and their windows gone. Above them all, the American kill chain remained intact, cold, adaptive, and fast. That was the real asymmetry. Not courage. Not even firepower alone. It was the speed at which one side could detect, decide, and strike while the other was still trying to understand which parts of its own system were real. Then came the decisive climax, the moment when destruction turned into strategic verdict. A series of precision strikes hit the tunnel mouths, ammunition galleries, and support ramps feeding the remaining coastal missile complex overlooking the critical transit corridor. Almost at the same time, explosives placed by ground teams collapsed sections of the subterranean command infrastructure from within, burying servers, communications trunks, and reserve control stations under shattered concrete and rock. Harbor facilities used to launch and refit swarm craft were rendered unusable. Mine deployment stocks were either destroyed in place or seized. Surviving boats that attempted breakout were intercepted before they could mass. In less than a night, the architecture of coercion that had taken years to build was not merely damaged. It was dismembered. And with it, something larger broke. Because Tehran's biggest dream was never just to fire missiles at ships. It was to make the world believe that any confrontation in the Gulf would end on Iranian terms, that geography guaranteed relevance, that proximity guaranteed deterrence, that hidden launchers and sacrificial swarms could offset the industrial precision of a superpower. The destruction of the physical network mattered. But the collapse of that belief mattered more. Once the strait could no longer be credibly held hostage, the political leverage attached to it began to evaporate. Fear had been a strategic asset. Now fear was changing sides. Still, professional militaries do not confuse a shattered enemy concept with total safety. Extraction began the moment the key objectives were confirmed. Ground teams moved according to clockwork timelines, carrying drives, documents, and biometric confirmations rather than souvenirs. Demolition was limited to what served the mission. Wounded were stabilized and moved first. Air cover tightened while surface escorts expanded outward to catch any late, desperate counterstroke. The sea remained dangerous. The shoreline still held pockets of weapons and men not yet accounted for. But the discipline of the withdrawal told its own story. This had never been a raid fueled by adrenaline. It was an operation designed from the beginning to end cleanly. As dawn bled over the Gulf, the physical scene looked almost unreal. Smoke columns rose from the coast in dark, slow pillars. Burned-out craft drifted near harbor mouths. Sealed tunnel entrances were now jagged cavities rimmed in dust. Radars that once watched the shipping lanes were gone or silent. On command nets, confusion gave way to fragmentation, then to silence from entire sectors. The narrow waterway at the center of the crisis remained where it had always been. Same currents, same cliffs, same unforgiving geography. But the military meaning of that geography had changed in a single cycle of darkness. The geopolitical aftershocks moved outward even faster than the fire did. Energy markets, primed for catastrophe, recalibrated. Regional states that had long balanced between caution and dependence understood the message with brutal clarity. The choke point could still threaten, but it could no longer guarantee strategic immunity. For Washington's partners in the Gulf, that meant breathing room and a warning. Security bought by naval presence was still security purchased under tension. For Tehran, It meant the loss of a coercive narrative that had shaped diplomacy, brinkmanship, and domestic propaganda for years. The strait had been more than a map feature. It had been a theater prop for power. Now the prop was splintered. In military academies and intelligence circles, the operation would be studied for different reasons. Some would focus on the integration of cyber disruption with maritime strike warfare. Some on the speed of kill chain compression in a literal environment dense with civilian and military clutter. Some on the role of special operations in converting remote sensing into actionable certainty. Others would study the negative lesson for Iran and every state that relies too heavily on fortress logic. Hardened infrastructure is only as strong as the network that allows it to act coherently. Once the network fractures, even the deepest bunker becomes a tomb with antennas. But beyond doctrine and briefings, another truth lingered. This was not an ending that made the region peaceful. It was an ending that made the region more honest. The Gulf would remain a place of rival fleets, nervous monarchies, proxy calculations, missile inventories, and sudden crises. Iran would still have tools. It would still have reach. It would still have appetite. The United States had not erased geography, ideology, or ambition. What it had erased was the assumption that a carefully layered coastal threat could automatically dominate the narrow sea between bluff and battle. That assumption had died first, in the dark, before the flames arrived. And so the final image is not one of triumph, but of warning. A tanker continues through the Strait of Hormuz at sunrise, its wake slicing across water that hours earlier was expected to become a graveyard of commerce. Above the horizon, smoke still hangs over the coast like a second mountain range. Somewhere inland, men who once believed they held the world's energy pulse in their fist now listen to dead channels and collapsing reports. The maps have not changed. The narrowness is still there. The vulnerability is still there. But the dream that this passage could be transformed into an untouchable instrument of Iranian destiny, that dream lies buried under shattered command rooms, flooded tunnels, and silent launch rails. History remembers places like this not because they are large, but because they are narrow. Narrow enough for ambition to imagine control. Narrow enough for fear to become policy. Narrow enough for a single night to redraw the meaning of power. And when the darkness closed over the Gulf, one lesson rose with the smoke. Whoever turns a choke point into a throne had better be prepared to defend it against the full machinery of modern war. Because the sea does not care about myths. It only remembers wreckage.